At 0647 hours on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John B. George settled into the shattered remains of a coastal bunker overlooking Point Cruz, steadying a rifle his battalion commander had called a mail-order joke just 18 hours earlier. 26 years old. Illinois competitive shooter. Multiple state championships at extreme distances. 0 battlefield kills. The Japanese had positioned snipers throughout the massive banyan and palm groves west of the Guadalcanal River, and in the preceding 72 hours, those hidden marksmen had killed 17 American soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. Men shot while filling canteens, walking supply trails, or standing in clearings for seconds too long. George's captain had shaken his head when he first saw the Winchester. The supply sergeant called it that deer gun. When George unpacked the Model 70 with its aftermarket scope at training camp stateside, the battalion armorer asked if he planned to hunt or actually fight. George said he planned to hunt men. They deployed before the rifle cleared logistics. George spent the Pacific crossing watching other officers clean their Springfield 1903s while his personally purchased weapon sat in a shipping crate somewhere in California. He filed paperwork to have it forwarded through military supply channels. 43 days later, in late December 1942, a mail clerk handed him a wooden box marked "Fragile, Sporting Goods." Inside was the Winchester Model 70 he had saved 3 years of weekend drill pay to afford. The rifle weighed 8 pounds, 12 ounces. The scope added another 14 ounces. The standard issue Springfield, carried by designated Army marksmen, weighed 9 pounds, 4 ounces, with basic iron sights and no magnification. George's Winchester was bolt action, 5-round internal magazine. The Springfield was also bolt action, but designed for military durability, not precision accuracy. His rifle had been built for one-shot terminal performance at distances most soldiers never attempted. Captain Morris told him to store the sporting rifle in the equipment tent and carry regulation ordnance. George carried it into combat anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved exhausted Marine units on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had fought since August, secured Henderson Field, held defensive perimeters, bled in the jungle. But they had not fully cleared Mount Austin, and they had not eliminated Japanese forces dug into the coastal vegetation west of the Guadalcanal. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet above sea level. The Japanese garrison called it Gifu. 500 defenders, 47 reinforced bunkers, interlocking fire lanes. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 consecutive days. 34 men killed. 279 wounded. They finally took the western slope on January 2nd, 1943. By that date, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times at enemy personnel. The jungle around Point Cruz operated under different rules. No fortified bunkers, no visible defensive lines, just Japanese soldiers who had withdrawn westward from Henderson Field and disappeared into the grove canopy. Some of those soldiers were trained precision marksmen. They carried scoped Arisaka Type 99 rifles. They understood concealment. They understood patience. They understood how to kill without being seen. On January 19th, a sniper killed Private First Class Davis while he knelt at a stream refilling canteens. Single shot, no follow-up. The shooter vanished. On January 20th, another hidden marksman killed 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol, both victims shot from an elevated position the patrol had walked beneath twice without detecting movement. On January 21st, 3 more soldiers died. One man was shot through the throat from a tree his squad had passed minutes earlier. The sniper had watched them approach, let them pass, then selected his target from behind. The battalion commander summoned George that evening. Japanese snipers were killing American soldiers faster than disease and exhaustion combined. He needed someone who could match their skill. He wanted to know if that civilian hunting rifle could actually accomplish anything in modern warfare. George explained his background. Illinois State Long Range Championship, 1939, 1,000 yards, youngest competitor to win in state history. 6-inch shot groups at 600 yards using only iron sights. With the scope-mounted Winchester, 5 consecutive rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards under field conditions. The commander gave him until dawn to prove those credentials meant something on Guadalcanal. If you want to see how a mail-order sporting rifle performed against elite Japanese snipers in the most hostile jungle environment of World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share stories like this that most people never hear. And subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. Back to George. George spent the night preparing his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in protective cosmoline for ocean transport. He stripped and cleaned every component again, checked scope mount integrity, verified zero alignment as best he could without test firing. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had personally packed in Tennessee. Military ball specification, same cartridge the M1 Garand fired, but loaded for accuracy rather than volume suppression. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into firing position inside the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had overrun 4 days prior. The bunker overlooked coconut palm groves and massive banyan trees west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports indicated enemy snipers operated from elevated positions in those trees. Some banyans reached 90 feet tall with trunks thick enough to conceal a man standing upright. A trained marksman could climb one of those trees in darkness, settle into position before first light, and remain undetected throughout the entire day. George brought no spotter, no radio man, no backup security. Just his rifle, 1 canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the broken concrete, rested the Winchester's forestock on stable rubble, and began scanning the jungle canopy through magnified glass. The rifle everyone had mocked was about to prove why precision matters more than firepower. The rifle resting against broken concrete that morning had not been born from military procurement or battlefield necessity. It had been born from obsession, the kind that builds slowly in a young man who discovers the only language he speaks fluently is precision. John B. George grew up in Illinois during the Depression, when most young men measured success in steady work and full meals. George measured it in fractions of an inch at impossible distances. By age 23, he was competing at state-level rifle championships, not because shooting offered fame or fortune, but because it offered truth. A bullet either hit the target or it didn't. Wind, breathing, trigger discipline. These were variables you controlled or failed to control. There was no middle ground, no excuses. In 1939, at the Illinois State Long Range Championship, George fired groups at 1,000 yards that judges initially questioned as measurement errors. He won the competition as the youngest shooter in state history. Other competitors used custom-built match rifles that cost more than most men earned in 6 months. George was shooting with iron sights and a borrowed Springfield. He knew he needed better equipment, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove something to himself. So he saved. Every weekend drill with the Illinois National Guard, every extra duty, every paycheck where others spent money on dates or new clothes or anything resembling a normal life for a man in his 20s, George set aside cash. It took 3 years. In 1941, he finally walked into a sporting goods store and ordered a Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope, the kind of rifle serious hunters carried into the Rockies for elk at 500 yards in thin mountain air. The rifle cost more than some men's cars. George carried it to ranges on weekends, learning its personality the way a pilot learns an aircraft. Every vibration, every response to temperature change, every minute adjustment needed for perfection. He didn't name it, didn't carve initials into the stock. The rifle wasn't a companion. It was a contract between discipline and outcome. Then the world went to war. When George's National Guard unit federalized in 1942 and deployed to the Pacific, the Winchester became a problem. Shipping manifests didn't include space for personal sporting rifles. Logistics officers raised eyebrows. Commanding officers raised objections. Regulations were cited. George filed the paperwork anyway and watched his rifle get packed into a crate destined for some warehouse while his unit boarded transport ships for the Solomon Islands. The voyage across the Pacific took weeks. George watched other officers maintain their standard-issue weapons. Springfield 1903s, M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns. He had nothing but a sidearm and paperwork promising his rifle would eventually follow through military mail channels. It felt like waiting for a vital organ to arrive by post. When the 132nd Infantry landed on Guadalcanal in December 1942, reality destroyed whatever romantic notions anyone had carried about jungle warfare. The island was a fever dream of mud, insects, rot, and industrial-scale dying. Malaria hollowed men faster than bullets. Dysentery turned soldiers into walking skeletons. The jungle itself seemed hostile to human presence. Everything either stung, cut, or poisoned. And then George's rifle finally arrived. Commanders who saw him unpack it thought he'd lost his mind. A sporting rifle? Here? Against an enemy dug into fortified positions with machine guns and artillery? Captain Morris said it plainly. "Leave the deer gun in your tent, Lieutenant." George nodded respectfully, then carried it into the jungle anyway. Guadalcanal didn't kill men cleanly. It rotted them first, physically, mentally, spiritually, before finishing the job with bullets or disease or simple exhaustion. The heat never relented. 100 degrees by mid-morning, humidity thick enough to drown in. Uniforms stayed wet. Skin turned gray and peeled. Boots disintegrated. Insects swarmed every exposed inch of flesh, and the jungle itself seemed alive with malice. Vines that cut like wire, mud that swallowed equipment, and darkness so complete at night that men standing 3 feet apart couldn't see each other. Point crews sat west of Henderson Field along the coastal groves where the jungle pressed against the ocean. It should have been secondary terrain, ground already contested, already passed through during earlier Marine operations. But in January 1943, it became killing ground. The Japanese who had retreated westward after losing Henderson Field didn't disappear. They adapted. And some of them were snipers. They didn't operate like American marksmen who fired from fixed positions with supporting infantry nearby. Japanese snipers climbed. They selected massive banyan trees or towering palms, some 90 feet tall with canopies dense enough to hide a man completely. And they climbed before dawn, settled into position, and waited. They carried scoped Arisaka rifles, rice for 2 days, and the kind of patience that turned hunting men into meditation. On January 19th, Private First Class Davis walked to a stream to refill canteens for his squad. The creek was narrow, shaded, considered safe. He knelt at the waterline, unscrewed a canteen cap. A single crack split the air. Davis collapsed forward into the water without a sound. No scream, no warning, just the crack, then silence, then red blooming downstream. The squad dove for cover, scanned the trees, saw nothing. They recovered Davis's body and pulled back. No one knew where the shot had come from. On January 20th, an L Company patrol moved through the coconut groves on a route they'd walked twice before without incident. The same route, the same trees. Midway through, two men fell within seconds of each other. Both shot from above, both killed instantly. The patrol returned fire blindly into the canopy, wasting ammunition on shadows. They never saw the shooter. Intelligence later determined both men had been killed by the same sniper from the same tree, a tree the patrol had walked directly beneath. On January 21st, 3 more soldiers died. One man was shot through the throat while standing in a clearing his squad had used as a rally point for 2 days. The sniper had watched them establish patterns, waited for confidence to replace caution, then executed. Fear spread faster than malaria. Men stopped talking in open areas. Patrols moved faster, hunched lower, eyes fixed on the ground, because looking up meant exposing your face, and the last man who looked up never looked down again. Supply runs became sprints. Soldiers refused to stop moving in the groves. The jungle, already terrifying, became supernatural. Every tree held a ghost. Every shadow hit a scope. Casualties climbed. Morale collapsed. Battalion leadership held an emergency meeting on the night of January 21st. They had no counter-sniper doctrine, no trained marksmen, no equipment designed for this kind of precise, elevated threat. Standard infantry tactics, suppressing fire, artillery, frontal assaults, meant nothing against an invisible enemy who killed one man at a time and vanished. The battalion commander stood in a tent lit by a single lantern and said what no one wanted to admit. "We need someone who can beat them at their own game." Someone mentioned the lieutenant with the civilian rifle. The one who'd won shooting championships. The one who'd insisted on carrying that mail-order Winchester, even after being ordered to leave it behind. The commander's response was immediate. "Get him." Dawn arrived slowly on Guadalcanal, not as sudden light, but as gradual separation of black from gray. George had been in position inside the ruined bunker for 40 minutes before he could distinguish individual trees from the mass of jungle. He didn't move, didn't adjust. Just watched through the Lyman scope as the world came into focus, 1 degree of illumination at a time. This was the part most men never understood about precision shooting. It wasn't about pulling a trigger. It was about becoming part of the environment, breathing with it, moving with it, waiting until the moment revealed itself. George had spent a decade learning this rhythm on Illinois ranges where only stakes were scores and pride. Now the stakes were 17 dead Americans and a battalion that had stopped believing they could win. He controlled his breathing. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. Heart rate dropped. Hands steadied. The Winchester's stock pressed against his shoulder like an extension of his skeleton. The jungle was never truly silent. Insects created a constant background hum. Birds called warnings to each other in languages older than human war. Leaves rustled. Branches creaked. Water dripped. Wind moved through the canopy in waves. For 3 hours, George watched and cataloged every sound, every pattern, every movement that belonged. Then, he saw something that didn't. A branch swayed. Just one. 30 degrees left of his primary sightline, roughly 240 yards distant, elevated approximately 70 to 80 feet in a massive banyan tree. The branch swayed when the wind had stopped. George didn't react. He watched, waited, let his eyes confirm what instinct suspected. The branch moved again, not with wind, but against it. A subtle shift, weight redistributing. Then he saw the shape. Not a branch at all. A human form wrapped in foliage, perched in a firing position, scope likely trained on the American supply trail below. George shifted his aim 2 degrees left, adjusted elevation for the extreme upward angle, exhaled halfway and held. The crosshairs settled on center mass. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked once. Sharp, clean, final. Through the scope, George watched the figure jerk backward, lose grip, and fall. 90 feet. The body crashed through branches, hit the jungle floor, and didn't move. For 5 seconds, the entire jungle went silent. Even the insects stopped. Then chaos. Birds exploded from trees, monkeys screamed warnings, and somewhere in the American perimeter behind George, a soldier shouted, "He got one! The lieutenant got one!" Word spread through the battalion like voltage. The mail-order rifle worked. The toy was lethal. The quiet officer from Illinois had just killed a Japanese sniper from nearly 250 yards at an impossible angle. George didn't celebrate, didn't stand, didn't acknowledge the noise behind him. He ejected the spent casing, chambered a fresh round, and returned his eye to the scope. Because he understood something the celebrating soldiers didn't yet realize. The other snipers had just heard that shot. They knew now that an American marksman was hunting them. They knew his position. They knew his capability. And they would respond. The duel had only begun. By noon on January 22nd, George had killed 4 Japanese snipers. Each kill followed the same disciplined pattern: observation, confirmation, breath control, shot. 2 more fell from banyan trees. 1 dropped from a palm concealed behind dense undergrowth. The 4th had positioned himself in a shell-damaged building the Americans had assumed was abandoned. George spotted him by the unnatural stillness, a shadow that never moved while everything around it swayed with tropical wind. 4 shots, 4 kills, 0 misses. The Japanese response was immediate and intelligent. At 13:23 hours, the first mortar round impacted 60 yards south of George's bunker position. He heard the distant thump of the tube, counted seconds, then felt the ground shudder as high explosive fragmentation detonated in the grove. Birds scattered. Dirt rained down. George understood instantly. They were ranging him. The second round hit 40 yards out, closer, more accurate. Whoever was directing that mortar crew had calculated his firing position from muzzle flash or sound signature and was walking shells toward him with methodical precision. Third round, 25 yards. Close enough that shrapnel hissed through the air above the bunker's damaged walls. Fourth round, 15 yards. The concussion wave hit like a physical slap. Concrete dust filled George's lungs. He grabbed his rifle, ammunition, and canteen, abandoned the position. The 5th mortar round obliterated the bunker 3 seconds after he cleared the entrance. The explosion collapsed what remained of the structure into a crater of shattered concrete and exposed rebar. If George had stayed to fire 1 more shot, if he'd prioritized 1 more kill over survival, he would have died in that rubble. He relocated 200 yards east to a fallen palm tree surrounded by dense ferns. Natural concealment. Lower profile. No obvious military structure to target. He settled in, checked his rifle for damage, none, and resumed hunting. The afternoon transformed into psychological warfare. George would spot movement, confirm a target, fire, then immediately displace before counterfire arrived. The Japanese snipers stopped using obvious positions. They began employing camouflage discipline that rivaled George's own training. Minutes stretched into hours of perfect stillness, interrupted by seconds of violence. By evening, he had killed 3 more. 7 total for the day. Word spread through the 132nd Infantry in whispers that carried the weight of prayer. That mail-order rifle is saving lives. Men who had mocked George now spoke his name with something approaching reverence. Patrols moved through areas that had been death traps that morning. Supply runs completed without casualties. The invisible killers were being erased one precise shot at a time. But George felt no pride that night as he cleaned his rifle by candlelight in his tent. Only wait. He had proven the rifle worked, proven his skills translated from competition ranges to combat zones, proven that a civilian weapon could outperform military doctrine. But 7 men were dead because of his skills. Enemy soldiers, yes, trained killers who had murdered Americans without mercy. But still men who had woken that morning, not knowing a quiet lieutenant from Illinois would end their existence from distances they never saw. Survival were not the same thing. And the burden of both was heavier than any rifle. On the morning of January 23rd, George spotted a Japanese sniper positioned in a coconut palm with textbook-perfect visibility over an American supply trail. Too perfect. The angle was ideal. The concealment was adequate, but not exceptional. The sniper's silhouette was just visible enough to be identified through magnified optics. George watched him for 11 minutes without firing, because something was wrong. A trained sniper, especially one who had survived yesterday's massacre, didn't position himself that obviously. Not after watching 7 colleagues fall to an invisible American marksman. This wasn't carelessness. This was bait. George shifted his scope 30 degrees right, scanning deeper into the canopy. Then left, then higher. Searching for what he knew had to be there. The real threat. The patient killer waiting for someone to take the easy shot. He found him 70 yards beyond the decoy, elevated 15 feet higher in a banyan tree wrapped in shadow and vegetation, so dense the human form was nearly invisible. The actual sniper had positioned himself to observe anyone targeting the decoy. Scope trained not on American soldiers below, but on the exact firing position a counter-sniper would use. It was brilliant tactics, and it would have worked against almost anyone else. George made his decision in seconds. He aimed at the decoy first, fired. The visible sniper fell from the palm tree. But George didn't watch him drop. The instant the Winchester cracked, he was already transitioning. Bolts cycled, fresh round chambered, scope sweeping right to the real threat. The hidden sniper had broken concealment the moment he heard George's shot, shifting position to acquire the source of fire. For half a second, his form became visible. George fired again. 2 shots, 2 kills, 3 seconds total. The second body fell through 90 feet of jungle canopy and hit the ground with an impact that echoed through the groves. An American patrol that had been pinned down nearby erupted in stunned celebration. They had watched the entire sequence, didn't understand the tactical complexity, didn't realize they'd just witnessed something beyond standard marksmanship. They only knew that the enemy's trap had failed and 2 more snipers were dead. But the Japanese commanders understood. Reports filtered back through their lines that night. The American wasn't just skilled. He was thinking faster than their tactics could adapt. He was predicting their movements, reading their deceptions, turning their own sophistication against them. They weren't fighting a marksman anymore. They were fighting someone who operated on a level that nullified experience and numerical advantage. The jungle war had shifted. Every remaining Japanese sniper in the Point Cruz sector now faced a psychological problem beyond training or courage. They were being hunted by someone better than they were. Someone who saw through camouflage and deception. Someone who made no mistakes. They were facing John George. And that meant their mission parameters had changed. Killing American soldiers was now secondary. Survival required eliminating the source of the threat. Intelligence officers began coordinating their remaining snipers, not to hunt Americans, but to hunt one specific American. They needed George dead. Not eventually, immediately, because if he lived another 48 hours, none of them would. By January 24th, the Japanese snipers stopped climbing trees. George had killed 9 men in 3 days by exploiting their elevation advantage. The survivors adapted with terrifying speed. If height meant death, they would hunt from the ground. They moved through the jungle in coordinated pairs, using infantry search patterns, sweeping methodically through the groves, checking sight lines, investigating any position that offered a clear field of fire toward American-controlled terrain. They were hunting George the way he had hunted them. He spotted the first team at dawn, 2 soldiers moving low through the undergrowth, roughly 100 yards apart, communicating with hand signals. They carried scoped rifles, but moved like infantrymen, tactical, deliberate, prepared for close-range contact. George could have engaged them from his current position in the dense ferns, but the shot would have revealed his location to other teams he couldn't see. So he displaced. Again. For 6 hours, the pattern repeated. George would observe enemy movement, withdraw before being detected, relocate to another hide, and watch the jungle shift around him like a living organism trying to expel a foreign body. The psychological pressure inverted everything he'd trained for. On competition ranges, you controlled the environment. Here, the environment controlled you. At 1440 hours, George heard boots. Close. Too close. He was positioned in a shallow depression overgrown with vines when 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line 30 feet away, moving directly toward his position. No time to withdraw. No clean shot without exposing himself first. They were actively searching, eyes scanning, rifles ready, communication tight. George slid backward into the only cover available. A flooded shell crater 6 feet across, half filled with stagnant rainwater and jungle rot. He submerged to his chest, held the Winchester above water with both arms extended, barrel skyward, praying the scope wouldn't fog. The water was cold despite the tropical heat. Fed by underground seepage, it chilled him instantly. He controlled his breathing to silence, mouth barely above the surface, eyes level with the crater's rim. The boots came closer. One soldier stepped to the crater's edge. So close, George could see mud caked on his puttees, could hear breathing, could smell sweat and gun oil. The soldier paused, looked down into the water. George's face was submerged, except for his nose and eyes, concealed by floating vegetation and shadow. The soldier moved on. His partner followed. Both men passed within 3 feet of George's position, sweeping the area, finding nothing. George waited, counted to 30, rose slowly from the water, rifle dripping but functional. The 2 soldiers were 15 yards away now, backs exposed, focus shifted forward. George fired twice. Bolt worked between shots with muscle memory precision burned into his hands by 10,000 repetitions on Illinois ranges. Both men collapsed before the second shot's echo faded. George crawled from the crater, soaked, freezing despite equatorial heat, and disappeared into the jungle before anyone could respond. He had survived by inches, and somewhere in the groves, the last 2 snipers realized their mission had failed. On the morning of January 26, 1943, the jungle around Point Cruz fell quiet in a way it hadn't been in weeks. No distant cracks from elevated positions, no sudden deaths on supply trails, no men collapsing while filling canteens or walking patrol routes. The snipers who had terrorized the 132nd Infantry Regiment for days, who had killed 17 Americans and shattered morale, were gone. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated in 96 hours. All by one man with a mail-order rifle. The relief was physical. Soldiers who had walked hunched and tense for days straightened their backs. Conversations resumed at normal volume instead of fearful whispers. Men looked upward again without expecting death. Patrols moved through the groves with tactical caution rather than paralyzing dread. George returned to the battalion command post on the evening of January 25th. Winchester slung over his shoulder, uniform soaked with mud and sweat and crater water. He didn't announce his success. Didn't need to. The absence of sniper fire spoke louder than any report. Officers who had mocked the civilian rifle now stared at it with something approaching religious reverence. The weapon they'd called a toy had accomplished what standard military equipment and doctrine couldn't. Captain Morris, the same officer who had ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent, approached him quietly that night and said 5 words. "I was wrong about you." But battalion command understood something deeper than vindication. This wasn't just one officer getting lucky with good equipment. This was proof that the U.S. Army had been fighting snipers incorrectly, reacting with volume firepower instead of precision, treating marksmanship as secondary skill instead of specialized warfare. On January 27th, George received new orders. Not to return to standard platoon duties, not to resume conventional infantry operations. Instead, build a sniper program from the ground up. Hand-select the best marksmen in the regiment. Train them not just to shoot, but to think like George thought. Patience over aggression, observation over reaction, one perfect shot over suppressive fire. George began with fundamentals. He formed 2-man teams, shooter and spotter, rotating roles, building redundancy. He taught camouflage that went beyond uniform patterns, teaching men to become part of the terrain, to understand light and shadow, to move when the environment moved. He drilled them on range estimation without instruments, on breathing control under stress, on the psychological discipline required to wait hours for a single 3-second opportunity. The results were devastating. Over the following months, George's sniper teams eliminated dozens of enemy soldiers, machine gunners, officers, forward observers, high-value targets whose deaths created tactical collapse. And they did it without suffering a single sniper operation casualty. Not one man trained by George died performing counter-sniper missions. The program worked because George had transformed individual skill into transferable doctrine. The Winchester had proven the concept. Now, properly trained men with properly scoped rifles were proving the system. But the war wasn't finished with John George. In 1944, he would receive orders that would take him from Guadalcanal's jungles to something far worse, Burma, and a unit that would become legendary for surviving what shouldn't have been survivable. Merrill's Marauders were waiting, and George's rifle was coming with him. Burma tested men differently than Guadalcanal. In 1944, George joined the 5307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders, for one of the most brutal campaigns in the Pacific Theater. They marched through mountain jungle that made Guadalcanal look forgiving. 1,000-mile treks through terrain without roads, without resupply, without relief. Men carried 70-pound packs through monsoon rains and climbed ridges so steep that entire mule trains fell to their deaths. Disease consumed soldiers faster than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, scrub typhus. The unit that started with 3,000 men finished with fewer than 200, still capable of fighting. George endured all of it. The marches, the fevers, the starvation. And through every mile, he carried the Winchester. When the war finally ended in August 1945, George returned home not as a decorated hero seeking parades, but as a man who had seen enough killing to last several lifetimes. He could have leveraged his reputation, written sensational memoirs, toured speaking circuits, built a career on battlefield celebrity. Others did exactly that. George chose differently. He enrolled at Princeton University, earned honors in international affairs, continued to Oxford, pursued scholarship over glory, intellect over fame. He understood that war had taught him about human nature under extreme pressure. But real wisdom required understanding why wars happened, not just how they were fought. Years later, he wrote Shots Fired in Anger, but not as propaganda or adventure tale. Instead, he produced one of the most detailed technical analyses of small arms combat ever published. Page after page dissected rifle performance, ammunition ballistics, tactical decision-making under fire. He wrote truth instead of myth, analysis instead of heroism. The book became required reading for military historians and infantrymen alike, not because it glorified combat, but because it explained it honestly. John B. George lived decades beyond the war. He built a life measured not by the 11 men he killed in 96 hours, but by the knowledge he shared, the students he taught, the scholarship he contributed. When he died, no headlines marked his passing. No national ceremonies honored his service. But his rifle survived. Today, the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope rests in a museum display case. Visitors walk past it regularly, just another old hunting rifle among thousands of World War II artifacts. The wood is worn. The metal shows age. Nothing about it suggests legend, until they read the placard. Then they stop. They stare. They realize they're looking at the weapon that was mocked as a mail-order toy, that was called useless by officers who thought they understood war better than a quiet lieutenant from Illinois. They're looking at the rifle that killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days, that saved countless American lives, that changed how the U.S. Army approached precision warfare. But more importantly, they're learning about the man who carried it. John George didn't win through arrogance or aggression. He won through skill, patience, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The courage to be doubted, to be mocked, to carry a rifle everyone said was wrong, and to prove through quiet competence that precision matters more than firepower. He wasn't the loudest soldier. He wasn't the most decorated. He wasn't the most famous. But he changed battlefield history with one rifle, 96 hours, and the discipline to shoot only when the shot mattered. That's the legacy that survives in museum glass and military doctrine. The legacy of a quiet giant who let his rifle do the talking.